about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Welcome to the MessianTics Podcast. Wanted to start a conversation this week that I hope becomes fruitful. Just recently, we went to a memorial service for Rabbi Robert Solomon, who was one of the early pioneers of the rebirth of the Messianic movement. His congregation was the first in the United States to actually, from the ground up, build a synagogue building and establish a Messianic Jewish community center. There were a whole bunch of Messianic rabbis from all over the country, as well as other leaders that were there from a few other organizations. But on the way back, it made me really think, because the entire service was sharing about his legacy, what he had accomplished, how he established what he did, who he was as a person, and remarkably, his son led part of the service, which I can't imagine how difficult it would be to lead a memorial service like that for your dad. But on the ride back home from the memorial, I got thinking about, if something happened to me, what would I want my children to hold on to as the legacy that I left? What if there was just one point, one thing beyond faith in Yeshua, but one thing that they looked and they said, this was what I remember about my dad. What would I want it to be? Because, we think about this from the standpoint of ministry, and I know sitting with me right now is my son, Rabbi David, and I know that there were many times, especially in the early days of our ministry, where if you asked him, what do you think the legacy of your father is, it would not have necessarily been positive things to him, not positive ministry-wise or accomplishments or faith, but the time that I spent away from him and the family, the choices that I made sometimes to rush to the aid of other people when I could have been with them, and so on. So it made me really think, as we listen to people sharing memories and thoughts of the legacy, Lador Vador, from generation to generation, of that particular leader, of Rabbi Solomon, what would I want my children or people that were memorializing me to think about and to hold up as, this is what he meant to me? So I thought it might be a decent conversation for us to have, because we all have children. Jonathan, I think you have the youngest child among us, but and Rabbi David's daughter is driving now, so there's a level there, and Rabbi Toby's children are in between those ages, but they're experiencing now some of the things that my children experience, and definitely some of the things that the people that saw, that looked at, and the fact that I want my children and now my grandchildren to have a positive legacy memory of me and my wife, and not just, oh yeah, he was a rabbi who stood behind a pulpit and did nice things for people. So I just want to kind of throw that out to you guys. If 40, 50, 60 years from now, when your children are doing your memorial, talking about you, or even now at that point, when your children talk to their friends about you, what things would you want them to be the primary thoughts about who you are, not just as a rabbi, but as a dad who is a believer? So I'm just going to throw that out, and whichever one of you guys wants to jump in first, we'll go from there.
For me, it's just, I have to think of a lot of people I talk to that are my age. I have to be honest, most of them have really like complicated relationships with their parents, either one or both. I think that's really sad. It makes me kind of depressed. To be honest, but because it makes me wonder, how are my kids going to talk about me when they get older? Because no parent's perfect. I learned that as soon as I became a parent. But I had a really complicated relationship with my dad for a number of years. Never really with my mom. It was never complicated with my mom. She was always, she was always really honest and integrous and did her best. My dad didn't always do his best. He just didn't. And he would admit that. So I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't say. He didn't always do his best. But in his later years, more recent years, I'd say the past 15 years, he's come around. And I don't mean, that sounds really cheap. He's really repented about a lot of things. So God's really done a lot of work in his life. I don't want to just say he's come around. That just sounds really cheap. But but I saw this TV show a couple years ago where this guy was memorializing his dad. And because it's really hard sometimes when you've had a complicated relationship with a parent to like buy them a Mother's Day card or a Father's Day card. It's like you're buying them a card that says, oh, you're the best dad in the world, or you're the best mom in the world. And if you don't feel that way, it's kind of stupid. But we do that because it's part of our culture. But the point is, I was watching this TV show and this guy was memorializing his dad. He had died, so it was at his funeral. And he said, my dad did a lot of crazy stuff and I didn't like a lot of what he did, but you know what? He was my dad. I love him. I'm like, oh gosh, I guess that's okay. I would never want my kids to talk about me like that. Like, well, he was my dad. To just state a fact, So I have to think about, if I want to think about what I want my kids to say about me, I have to think about, I have to think about what I would say about my father, or how I think about him, or what I didn't have, what I couldn't say about him when I was young, which was tough to kind of come to terms with when I got older. I would look back, I was like, oh gosh, I wasn't really, when I was a kid, it was really tough because of how I was. And I wasn't really, I didn't really have a lot of positive thoughts about him often. This is a heavy conversation. But the fact is that, I remember when my parents got divorced. I'm not trying to make this therapy session, but my parents got divorced when I was 13. And what do the parents always tell their kids when they get divorced? It's not your fault. It's not your fault. You didn't. It's not because of you. And I knew that. And they always say, and no matter what, we love you, right? They always say that. We love you no matter what, even though we're not going to be married anymore. So my parents got divorced. And that was one of the things that, I was told, like, oh, don't worry, I love you. It doesn't matter. Those words don't mean anything when your parents get divorced. When everything falls apart, it doesn't really matter. You don't feel that way. You don't feel like you're loved. In this case, it was by my dad because he was the one that left, but not my mom. My mom wasn't really a party in that. It was really my dad decided to take off, But I couldn't say that I felt like I was valued, right? So I don't. The fact is that people die every day, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm just saying that there are guys that drove. There are dads that have driven forklifts for decades. That drove a forklift for 40 years, and he took care of his family, and he was there for his wife, and he was there for his kids, and they probably would never have a memorial service for him because I guess he didn't start something special. But I think he did something incredible. I'm not knocking a memorial service for any person that did something really special. I just think sometimes we look at achievements and we look at what somebody built, and we're like, oh, isn't that incredible, the influence they have? I'm not saying it's not. It's just, for me, being now a parent, I find one of the most difficult things is just doing that. I think one of the most amazing works is what you do in your own home, and how increasingly difficult it is to sometimes just keep that together, because we're very faulty as people, a husband and a wife, two people coming together and getting married and stuff. It's very complicated. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a movie. It's not a cartoon. But so I promise I'm getting to a point. The point is that I think about that all the time, though, when people, when there's like a big thing about somebody passing away, whether it's like a president or a public figure or something, I'm always like, there's so many guys out there that like work so hard for their families and stuff, and they're like really good family men, and they're good parents, and they're good husbands, and nobody makes a big deal about that. Nobody makes a big deal, I think, about that, which is just so. What I would want my kids to say about me was, my dad loved me. Yeah. He was there and he loved me. Yes, of course he loved God. I would want that. I would want I would want my life with God to go to pass on to them, like when David passed on to Solomon. Like, listen, be a man, don't abandon the Lord, right? But I really would would want my kids to be, because if a kid if you don't grow up under that security of knowing that you're loved and valued just simply because of your being. I always felt like I had to perform for my dad when I was a kid. So if you don't feel blessed in your being, if you don't feel loved just in your existence, without having, not because of what you give, just because of your being, what you are, that if you don't have that, you have such a deficiency growing up, such a struggle growing up. And I had that, and I still have that at times. Gosh, I still have that, if I can be completely frank with everybody. But so I think what I relish in and what I enjoy is when my kids, just when I can see that they're secure because they know that they're loved unconditionally, and that they can have a bad day, and I can see them, I see how fast they recover from failure because they know they're loved. I don't recover from failure quickly because I always felt like I had to perform through my formative years. So even though I know that that's not true, because that happened during a time when I was growing, I'm stuck with that to a degree. Yeah. So God has to give me a lot of grace in that area.
There's still an element of hardwiring there.
Yeah, there's an element of hardwiring that I have to perform, but I'm not hardwiring that into my kids. And I think that if I died and I was being eulogized, if my son just said, man, my dad loved me, and I knew he did, man, that would do it for me. So, yeah, that's where I'm at, I guess, with that. I think that's important. So,
yeah. No, I definitely want Eli to remember me as someone who really did love him. I also want to leave him with, hopefully he'll be able to look back one day and that I will have been a man of nobility and honor and virtue for him and to those around me, to the world around me. That, when he's able to talk to his, hopefully his children and those that he mentors one day, that he'll be able to take those same lessons and pass those on as well. And that in the midst of that, because I joke around a lot, but I also take life very seriously. And I treat people seriously until they give me reason not to. And hopefully my desire would be for him to see that you should treat life seriously. You should take God seriously. You should
as Paul tells us to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, you should take your salvation seriously. You should live life full of virtue and honor, but also be able to crack around because, life is so serious most of the time that you have to maintain a sense of humor to be able to get through it. Because we kind of live in an anomaly, like our space, our period of time, this level of removal from. You look at the rest of the world. The rest of the world is engaged in warfare. Every decade, just about. We haven't. All of our wars have, for the most part, been overseas. And so our society as a whole doesn't demand necessarily that its citizens necessarily have to take up being noble and honorable, which is why we have so many scalawags nowadays, is because there's society doesn't have a huge demand for that we don't have the crises that call and demand for people to be noble. And so, even despite the lack of on-continent crises, and we have some. We have difficulties in our own country. I want whatever I have to face in life to approach it nobly and to come out of it still with my honor and virtue intact, and to be able to give that to him. So that way he will be a man of honor as well. Because that's not something that's terribly common.
When I was in New York, I worked under Rabbi David Rosenberg at S3E27 on Long Island, and one of the things that he talked about a lot was not just his desire for the Word of God, but his desire for his children to see that in him, like that he modeled it, and discipleship as a whole, but especially being in the Word regularly and using the Word as a guiding point and so on. And so he talked about how he would go out of his way every morning to wake up early before the kids would get up. So if they were getting up for school in the morning, they had to be up at 6 o'clock to get ready for the bus or whatever. He was up at 5:30, so that he was sitting at the table in the dining room reading the Word, intentionally in the Word. And his kids would wake up in the morning, and the first thing they'd see when they come downstairs is Dad in the Word. And then he would be at night. He would make sure that before they went to bed, the last thing they saw at night was him in the Word. And I kind of took that to heart and tried to model that for my children as best I can. I want my kids to see the validity, the impact of the Word in a consistent way in my life and our life, the way we do things, and so on. And so I've strived to, as best I can. I'm not perfect at it. There's a lot of times I get too busy and not able to do it or whatever, but to get up in the mornings and spend time in the Word before anything else, and so on. And now in the when my kids were younger, they would wake up earlier. First thing in the morning, they'd come running out. They'd see me there. And then if for whatever reason they didn't see me already, if I'd gotten up even earlier and I had already read and was getting dressed or whatever, they'd come, did you already read? Did you already read? Did you read? Did you? Now they're in their mid-teens, and they could care less about waking up in the mornings, and it's 10, 11 o'clock when they're finally rolling out of bed,
or what Dad is doing.
Exactly. They're 10 or 11 o'clock finally rolling out of bed, and what have you. But so they don't really see it anymore, because a lot of times I'm out the house before they even get up, but they still will come, hey, did you read today? Hey, did you do? And there's one, it's like this accountability. Like, it's cool that my kids are holding me accountable. I think that's great. They're learning a lesson about accountability and so on. Right. But also the fact that it's been impressed on them that this is a value that's important in life. And so, that's a big thing for me. The other thing for me, aside from like life lessons I've attempted to teach them or whatever in regards to discipleship or just life in general, is I want my kids to be able to look back and see that their dad was a man of God, but wasn't like fake pious about it. Like, I am, like Jonathan was saying, you got to be serious, but you also got to kind of play around some, right? I am not, and I tell people at the synagogue, people will call us or email and say, hey, I want to come visit. What's the dress code? It's like, we don't have a dress code. As long as you wear clothes, we're good. Yeah. Like, there's no dress code. We're as long
as 75% of you is covered,
right?
We're okay.
we're a Messianic synagogue in like a beachy touristy area. So most people in the area generally aren't dressing up much better than, khakis and a polo shirt to begin with for anything. You go to almost any church in the area, and that's usually what you're going to see is best dressed is khakis and a polo.
Hawaiian shirts, bro.
Yeah, you go to some of your more, traditional high churches or whatever, you might see, suits or even a shirt and tie or whatever, but it's really a lot more laid back in our area. And so, which is good for me because I am not a dress to the T's kind of guy. Rabbi Toby and I are two vastly different people when it comes to that. He shows up in three-piece suit and a tie for services, and I show up with a button-down shirt untucked and a pair of jeans, climbing off a motorcycle. And but I want my kids to see in my life, and then it be a lasting thing in their life that. It's important to be who you are, who God made you to be in your walk with God, not to try to be what everybody else thinks you should be or tells you should be or whatever else. And that's not to say that whether or not you wear a tie makes it or breaks it on that. But God created each of us as individuals, and there's a necessity for individuality in the way we do things, right? And who we are and live our lives. And, I'm a really sarcastic person. And so I joke around with folks and, make quips about things, whatever, and so on. But, I want my kids to know and to look back and go, look, Dad was authentic. He was, an individual. He was himself. But even in that, God was a priority. His relationship, his walk with the Lord was a priority. We were a priority. The congregation was a priority, and to recognize that there are levels of priority, right? Your relationship with God comes first. And I think the heart of Timothy, the passage about shepherds and deacons and so on, the heart of what Paul is saying to Timothy there is that your family is the microcosm that sets the pattern for what your congregation is supposed to look like. And that's why it's so impressed in there that, the family has to be in good order. Not that the family has to be perfect, right? You're not disqualified if your kid lies or if your kid, catches a speeding ticket or if your kid, does any other idiotic thing that teenagers do at any point in their life. Your family's not disqualified. You're not disqualified, but your family is in order. Like, you set a precedent as the leader of your family. And then because your congregation is going to be looking to that, right? It shouldn't be the other way around. Your congregation shouldn't be the priority above your family. Your family is the priority. Your congregation can never learn to trust. Like we've talked about before on here, where Paul says, wives submit to your husbands love your wife like Messiah loved the body, etc. The wife has nothing to submit to if she doesn't see the husband doing what he's supposed to do, right? And the husband sets the pace. He's the one that's supposed to love her in such a way that she's willing to submit to him, that she's willing to trust his spiritual guidance and so on. And the same is true in ministry. We're all sitting here in this podcast because we're all in congregational leadership in a Messianic synagogue. And so a huge part of our life, our priorities, what we do on a daily basis is focused on our congregations. And our congregations have to be able to look at our family and the way we live our lives in a family nucleus as the example of how that family that is the congregation exists, right? And so it's not put on a show on stage and then beat your kids and your wife behind scenes. It's not put on a show on stage and show up for everything that everybody needs in the congregation at the cost of ever showing up for anything your family needs. Those kind of things are they have to be balanced, right? Hospital visits are important, but you don't sacrifice your family to make those. There's ways to do them both, and ways to know that if you have to go, make a sacrifice to go do something in the congregation, your family understands is on board with that, and they don't see that as a sacrifice or a loss that they're paying for you to do what you're supposed to. You know what I mean? And so I think that family priority is so vital, so important. And I'm not always great at it. I try my best. And as my dad said, looking back when I was younger, there are definitely things that, and even today, it's still kind of, you see it rear its head sometimes, that there are, were situations where I wasn't necessarily thrilled with what he did for the congregation versus being there with us and what have you. And so I've tried to learn from that, not just look at it like, hey, you were a crap dad in this scenario. Like, that's not what I'm looking at it as, but I don't want my kids to have that same experience. So I try to learn from that for my family. And so, my hope is that when the time comes that I bite it and my kids have to get up and say something at a funeral for me or a memorial service or whatever else we want to call it, that my kids are able to get up and say that my dad loved us, that my dad was there for us, my dad was there for our congregation, and that he was a man of God who was very much himself. And people either loved it or hated it, but they saw who he was in God no matter what.
Yeah, I was thinking as I was driving the other day on the way back from the memorial what I would want, and I appreciate all that you guys have said. But I was thinking about the people in the Bible that, like, you think about Abraham, and Abraham's known as the father of the faithful, but he was not perfect in any way, but to the point where he lies about his wife being a sister. There's things that he does that aren't. He was told not to bring any family with him. He brought Lot with him anyhow, those kind of things. But we still look at him as the father of the faithful. We look at Noah and say Noah was a righteous man in his generation, but he gets off the boat, gets drunk. As we look at Moses, who was this great leader of Israel, but doesn't circumcise his children and bring them into covenant. So there's all these people that we think about in the Bible that we look at and say, man, he was a man of faith, a man of God. They also were failures in many ways. And I was thinking, I want my kids to look at me as a man of God and understand that doesn't mean I didn't have any failures, but that the fact that I served God, that I loved my wife and loved my kids was more than those. Like if the scale was there, that my faithfulness, my love for God, my love for my wife, my love for my family was heavier than the things that I did that were human and imperfect. And see that way. So when they look at me, and I'm not saying I'm an Abraham or a Moses or a David, but when we think about those people, these heroes of our faith, we don't generally first think about their failures. We first think about the attributes of godliness and their love for God, and that David was a man after God's own heart, even though he was, an evil guy who killed a man to steal his wife. We don't think about those things in those terms. And so my hope is that my children and my grandchildren, when they think of me, even though they've seen my failures at times, my love for them, love for God, my walk is such that their first thoughts are, he was a man of God who loved his family, and not those other things. And so that's really my hope, is that when they think about me, when the time comes, that their first thoughts will be like we think about Abraham, the father of the faithful, or Moses, the man who delivered, through God used to deliver Israel from Egypt, or David, the one who was a man after God's own heart, or Noah, the man who was righteous in his generation, and not Judas, or Ahab, or Jezebel, or Saul, or those that we look at and their negative attributes are what we first think about rather than their positive. Right. So my hope is that that my life is enough on the positive and impact them in a positive way enough that they overlook my negatives when they're thinking about me.
Yeah, and I think that we all want that, and I think that, because when you mention Abraham, I agree with everything you said. the interesting thing about Abraham is if they did a memorial for Abraham, like let's just say it all happened today, Abraham, he did everything he did in the Bible or whatever, and then he died, and it was like present day, you know, and they had a memorial. I think that if Isaac was giving the memorial, I think Abraham was a great dad, but I think if you were the other kids that got sent away and just given a gift because they weren't Isaac, I think it'd be a really awkward memorial. So that's the thing, is the interesting thing is I do believe Abraham was absolutely a righteous man. The Bible attests to that. I just think it's interesting too that, like, you know, you brought up a couple guys, whether it's or even Jacob. If Jacob had a memorial, well, that would be interesting. You would have, you know, all these brothers, and maybe they would say, I think they would say some good things about their dad, but they would probably also talk about how he played favorites with his kids. I don't know, you know, they probably wouldn't talk about that, but they'd probably be feeling that, you know. I really strive not to do that with my children. I never want them to feel like I favor one over the other, or, and that's hard to do sometimes. I'm just saying that, but yeah, it's interesting. I think that if Abraham had a memorial today, like I said, because he was really great to Isaac, and then like he had kids after Isaac, he took a wife after Sarah died and had more kids. And then said, all right, here's a gift. Get out of here. Get away from Isaac. This is the one right here. And I don't think God necessarily wanted him to do that. That doesn't diminish the promise that was on Isaac, but I don't think God wanted him to throw his kids away, which he did.
Yeah, and it's interesting when we talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael and so on, that Ishmael, even though he was put away and all, came back for Abraham's funeral.
Yeah.
Like when we're talking about memorials, Ishmael thought enough of his dad to come back for his funeral, which, you know, there's, even in that case, there was enough of Abraham's love or whatever, relational.
Yeah, it was Sarah that wanted him sent away, ultimately. Right. I mean, I don't think she had Abraham do it.
Right.
It's really interesting when you step back and look at how it went down. It was very, very, it's very, something you'd see on a TV show.
Yeah.
It's ultimately Sarah was like, you need to get them out of here. And it was ultimately, all of it was her idea.
It was like Dallas, only in Israel.
Right.
Pre-Israel.
But no, I agree with you. You know, when you consider those things, it's and somebody made the point. It was a pastor, and you know, again, he's a pastor. He was Christian, and he made this, and it relates to our topic. He was talking about Jacob when he died, where he asked to be buried, and it was in the cave where Leah was buried. He did not get buried where Rachel was. He got buried with Leah, and he said, "Listen, I'm not Jacob." He goes, "But something tells me that maybe, just maybe, he did come to appreciate her over the years, because Rachel, he was crazy about. Leah, he got stuck with, and God blessed Leah because of that, because of how she was being treated." Which I think is another powerful message the Bible teaches, is that God, when God sees someone being mistreated, he blesses that person because of their mistreatment. Now, it's just interesting that Jacob asked to be buried with Leah, the wife that was called unloved. It makes you wonder how he remembered her after she died.
Yeah.
You know, it makes you wonder if he looked back on that and was like, man, she really went through it. I really put her through it. You know, she didn't ask for any of that, and God blessed her. And it was just interesting that he got buried in that cave with her. That's right. Where he gets buried, in the cave where she was at.
Well, and to that effect, when Rachel died, she was kind of buried on the side of the road. Like, it wasn't even a big to do. It wasn't. Yeah. They didn't find a proper burial. It was just kind of like, oh, we got to deal with it. So she was buried on the side of the road. I mean, in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't necessarily literally like on the side of the road, but I mean, that was the general gist of it. Whereas there was something official that Leah got in her burial too. That I think is interesting to see that comparison. Yes. And that's one of, going back to what you were saying, Rabbi Eric, is that's one of the things, that stood out to me at the memorial service. And we went just to show respect and support and all. And what's interesting is, and Rabbi Robert Solomon, impacted a lot of people in the movement. He was very influential, but also very much a kind of mentor-like figure for a lot of people and so on. But it was interesting seeing the number of people that came to faith in Yeshua because of him, like directly led to faith in Yeshua because of him. And not that they went, here's, the tally board of how many people, but firsthand stories, people going, I wouldn't have met my Messiah if it wasn't for, this kind of stuff. And then when Rabbi Kevin got up to talk about his dad, he said, look, my dad was a powerhouse. He was a great guy, a man of faith. He was, all these great things. He goes, and listen, that's not to say he was without shortcomings. He was like, my dad had, he wasn't perfect. There were definitely some things that were, I would have loved to have seen different. But weighing that to who he really was, he said, what you really see is the how good of a person he was, how godly of a person he was, etc. And yeah, I think there's something to that. Look, we're never going to be perfect on this side of eternity.
I think that we do a disservice sometimes, and I know I interrupted you, I'm sorry, but I'm not really. But when we look at our fathers and we compare them to God, in other words, God's the perfect father, without fault, without failure. And we try to look at our fathers as if they should be that way. And I appreciated when Kevin said that, just to agree with what you're saying. Here's his dad who did all these things, but he said, but there were still, I don't have rose-colored glasses that I don't see anything beyond that.
Right.
I don't remember where I was, so.
So anyhow, I don't know, how this episode fits into the scheme of all of our other episodes, but I think it's important that we discuss some things like this because part of MessianTics is Lador Vador, it's generation to generation. It's keeping the traditions of our people. It's keeping those things that way, and that starts with, as Rabbi David said earlier, our families. God created two people, then he created a family, then he created a larger family, a community, and then a nation. And if we're going to have healthy congregations, we're going to have healthy families. And I think we're all striving for that. And we want not only our congregations to think back at our life and say, hey, this was a godly man, this is a man of God, this was a powerhouse, this was that. But we want our children to say this was a good man, this was a godly man, this was a righteous, because they're the ones who see us day to day in the house. They see us when we step on the Lego, or the tire gets flat on the car, or the dishwasher breaks, or the bills are coming in and they're greater than our income. And those moments, our kids see that, and that's really when the real us shows up. And that's when what I'm striving for, what I think we're all striving for, is that when our children see us, they see us as men of God, but as fathers who were men of God and had our priorities in order, or at least are striving to have our priorities in order. And that when they remember us like we remember Abraham and Moses and David and others as men of God, men with a relationship with their families and God, and look past our failures to see God in our lives.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to keep in mind, and I don't, it's not that, I don't know why my mind goes to this when I'm at a memorial for someone. But oftentimes if I'm either watching like a state funeral on TV, or I'm at a memorial for someone who's done a lot of stuff, like a public figure, my mind inevitably just goes to a place of like, God, not everybody gets this kind of send-off on earth. And that's nothing to take away from the person that we're honoring, like Rabbi Solomon. I think he deserved that. I'm not. But my mind does inevitably be like, what about the guy that's like As I said earlier in the episode, I said, what about the guy who loves you with all his heart and he just mops floors for a living? And the reason why is because, and I just think of like, okay, King David was a notable figure. He was a righteous man and he was very important. And as much as I think of David, I have moments where I think of, but you know what? Jesse raised him. And even though Jesse's only mentioned a few times, there had to have been something special about that guy because he raised David. Now, and we saw his failures because he didn't think David was was up to snuff to even bring him to the lineup for Samuel. But that's a shortcoming. But he raised David, who was a man after God's own heart. So there was something really special about Jesse, but we don't talk about him. Or Jesse's father. These men were raised. These men raised. So when you see a really righteous man, you have to think somebody had an impact on that person that God chose to birth something through. It's like I heard somebody say, he said, like, think about Martin Luther King. He goes, some bozo shared him the gospel. Shared the gospel with him. And now, he didn't mean that in a bad way, like he's a bozo, but he's saying that some no-name guy, somebody that we've never heard of, I don't know how he came to know the Lord, but somebody shared the gospel to somebody that it got to him.
Mm-hmm, right.
And what I'm saying is that what I want to encourage the listeners at is this, is just simply saying that please don't get caught up in thinking I have to do something worthy of having a book written about.
Right.
Right.
I was thinking about Joseph.
Yeah.
Yeshua's father on earth, who's mentioned a couple of times in the scripture, and yet he was chosen by God to raise Yeshua. Mm-hmm. Yet Mary gets venerated, and Joseph is almost
he's just part of the nativity.
Yeah, it was like he was a plus one. Like Mary was the one who was invited, and Joseph was the plus one who just kind of hung out. But he deserves that memorial, that place of God chose him to be the one that would raise Yeshua.
I was talking with somebody the other day, and they said they were talking about how they were with this lady that had kids when they got together, and he didn't have kids, but he was raising them as his own and all. And we all know people like that. Like my brother-in-law, very much took his wife's two daughters as his own kids and loves them, treats them that way. And
I have a good friend
and he said, it takes a certain type of man to raise his kids. It takes a whole other type of person to raise somebody else's kids like they were his own. And you look at Joseph, right? Very literally, you can't make a better statement than that for him, right? Like this was a miraculous conception, a miraculous birth that literally he had nothing to do with, and raised God's kid as his own. Could you imagine being the earthly father of Yeshua?
Yeah.
Especially when you look at how often in the Gospels Yeshua's teaching and he talks about my Father in heaven, and Joseph's like, I was here too. Like,
and when you think about the fact that Joseph actually, by marrying Miriam while she was pregnant, put his life on the line, because the penalty for having relations outside of marriage was death under the Torah. And, from an outward look, nobody was in the room to see the Ruach come upon Miriam and her become pregnant. So everybody around looked at Joseph as if he had relations with Miriam before they were married, and he took that weight of that reality on him and raised that child knowing it wasn't his child. And I mean, you got
to wonder how many people looked at that and were like, the math ain't math in here.
Yeah. So it's, there's a whole lot of things that go into that. And so it's just really important that we understand. And again, what is the legacy? What is the memorial? What is the place? And Rabbi Toby's right. Everyone from the CEO, the rabbi, the pastor, the guy who mops the floors and cleans the toilet, the guy who drives the delivery truck, or is the bond tradesman, making millions and millions of dollars. Each of them in God's eyes is equal. And each of them, if they have a family, should strive to have the same memorial, the same memory to their children, that they loved God and they loved their family.
Yeah, I think the perfect memorial is like, because people talk about legacies and stuff. I mean, I think there's a place for that. Somebody asked me something a while back. I forget what it was. They're like, what would you want? What's the one thing you want out of life or something? I hate when people ask those questions. It's so dumb. You know what I'm saying? Because it's hard to answer. Like, where do you picture yourself in 5 years? Remember, you get those questions I think are silly.
Yeah. Icebreaker questions.
So what do you want out of life? What do you want? And I'm like, honestly, it happens in the scripture. I think it's either 1 Kings or 1 Chronicles. I think it's 1 Kings. It's when God speaks to Solomon and says to him, if you follow me the way that your father David did, he goes, you'll be good. Basically, I'll be with you. If you follow me like your father David did. And when I look at David's life, I'm like, well, God, David didn't always follow you. He, like we talked about, he failed a lot. And I'm like, man, that's God's grace that he edited David's sins. And not David, God himself said to Solomon, hey, you remember your dad? Do what he did.
Yeah,
that's what I want. I want God to tell my kids, do what mom and dad did. And then I'll be like, I did it.
Yeah, my desire is, I guess, if you were to put it into a nutshell in getting ready to close the episode, is that if my children get in a jam, if they're like Jacob running away from Esau, that they turn to the God of my father. And that my relationship with God is enough for them to look to the God that I presented, the God that I serve, the God that I... So, because they're going to have struggles in life. David and Andrew already have. They're grown and have the children of their own, but I want them to... I want my relationship...
Wait, did you say the children are the struggle? That was...
Sometimes. But I want my legacy to be that when my children or my grandchildren have a problem in life, that they can turn to the God of my father and, of their father, of their grandfather, that my relationship was strong enough that they saw enough of it in it that they knew where to turn when they needed something.
And, Rabbi Toby brought up a good point that, when Solomon took over, God said, in essence, be like your dad, be like David. I think ultimately, I don't really care what's said at a funeral or memorial or whatever for me, whether from my own kids, my wife, my congregants, whatever. I don't think I really care about any of that. I think ultimately, if my kids, Proverbs says, raise up a child in the way they should go, and when they're older, they'll never depart. It's not raise up a child in the way they should go and they're never going to walk away from God, or they're never going to sin, or they're never going to... It says raise up a child in the way they should go, and when they're older and they have to make their own choices, when they come to God, they'll never depart, right? Because you set that foundation. Yeah. I think ultimately the greatest memorial what's it called when somebody talks about you at your death or at your funeral? Eulogy. Thank you. The greatest eulogy, my mind went completely blank. I think ultimately the greatest eulogy I could ever experience isn't in what would be said about me at my funeral, but in what the legacy of my life lives on in my own children. Do they grow up walking with the Lord and prioritizing their families and so on? Is their walk with the Lord like, Solomon being, God, hey, be like your dad. Right. Like if my kids grow up walking with the Lord and desiring to have the relationship they witnessed in my life, my wife's life, and their life with God, I think I could care less what's said about me at my funeral. I could care less what anybody else thinks. If my kids are walking right with God, I count that as a win, and the most important win. Well, with that said, thanks for joining us today as we randomly talk about something entirely unrelated to Messy Antics, but nonetheless vital and important. And share your thoughts with us. Let us know if you have any ideas for future topics on the podcast, and we will see you guys next week.
Thank you for listening listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.